Few years ago, we didn't really mention those little voices in our heads, the ones that chat to us all day long. But these days, it's all out in the open, and we've all become aware of that self talk, in particular, the inner critic. But have you ever wondered how this voice impacts us at an emotional level and even a cellular level? What about a cellular level? Now, just to be clear, I'm not talking about emotions, because whether we like them or not, emotions are a feedback loop. They tell us how we're experiencing a particular situation, and they tell us when things aren't right. So with emotions, we can be curious about how we feel. The inner voice is how we talk to ourselves, and it doesn't need to be triggered by anything at all. It runs in the background on a loop. So we can experience anger or sadness, and we can acknowledge that as an experience. But what we tend to do is compound that emotion by turning it in on ourselves with negative self-talk. So just to be clear, I'm not talking about suppressing negative feelings or emotions. I'm talking about noticing that inner voice and making it a little bit kinder and compassionate. So today I want to demonstrate the impact of self-talk in a way that's so memorable that it's going to stick in your mind every time you catch yourself with those negative thoughts. Welcome to the Right Experiment. So over the past few months, I've been conducting some research which involved talking to jars of rice. I know it sounds absolutely insane, but it's based on the work of Masaru Emoto. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. And he concluded that sound could impact the molecular structure of water. I've got no idea what prompted him to begin this research, but he came to the conclusion by playing music to water and then freezing it, that music could impact the structure of water. So when the music was lyrical and beautiful, when he played something symmetrical like Bach or Mozart, the frozen water would contain perfectly formed snowflakes. If the music was distorted, then the snowflakes that formed in the water crystals would be distorted as well. He also tried the experiment with words. So this is a picture of the word thank you being repeated to a jar of water continually before it was frozen. And this is an image of the words you fool being repeated to water. So as you can see, the you fool is quite distorted and the thank you looks quite pleasant. And this was the premise of the experiment. Now, these experiments actually involved quite a lot of complex technical equipment, but luckily for us, he found a way that people like me and you could just try this for ourselves using jars of rice. And this led to a bit of a craze in Japan where everybody was setting up the jars of rice and talking to them. So we thought, no expense spared, let's try the experiment ourselves and share the results with you. Now, you might be thinking, what have jars of rice got to do with the inner critic? And I will come on to that in a minute. But for now, I'd just say focus on the water. So let's see how it all works. About 3 months ago, we set up 3 jars of rice, and the aim was to talk to one of them positively, one of them negatively, and the third one was just going to be ignored. So let's start by looking at one of our little jars of rice. Now, this is the jar of rice that we ignored. And as you can see, the rice looks pretty flat and it's surrounded by water. It's not quite white and it's discoloured a little bit. Now, this might not seem particularly odd until I tell you what we put into the jar in the beginning. When we started this experiment, we added boiled rice to each jar, no water, just boiled rice. So what we're seeing here is a little bit of a parting of company. The water in the jar that we've ignored has separated itself from the rice. So what we'll do now is take you through the experiment and you can see what that jar looked like when we started the experiment. So, sparing no expense whatsoever, we saved 3 coffee jars and used these for the experiment. We used normal basmati rice and we boiled it. Now, the inside of my washing machine drawer literally goes black, and I wanted to make sure that this wasn't tainting any of the results. So we actually used filtered water to boil the rice. Probably a bit over the top, but full disclosure. So the jar we've just seen was completely ignored. No label, no chatting. We just looked at it occasionally to see what was happening, and the rest of the time it was just shoved in a cupboard. And the more I learned about energy, the less I wanted to shout at a jar of rice. I really didn't want to be channeling that sort of energy. So luckily, Mike, aka tech support, thanks for the video, Mike, volunteered to be nasty to the 3rd jar of rice. My jar had a picture of Pollyanna, and if you've seen this film, Pollyanna plays the glad game, and Hayley Mills stars as Pollyanna, and she literally goes wandering around the village trying to cheer everybody up. So each day I spent a minute chatting to Pollyanna, and I simply told her about all the things I was glad about that day. I thanked her for taking part in the experiment and for being a gorgeous, light and fluffy jar of rice. Now, on one occasion, I even took her for a little trip around the garden to see the flowers. So we had some great chats. I would highly recommend this. It's a lot of fun just talking to a jar of rice. Now, again, just a word of warning if you're going to try this at home. The first thing that happened to all of the jars of rice was they all started to go mouldy, and this was because we didn't let the rice cool before we added it to the jars. So if you are going to try this at home, remember to let the rice cool properly before you add it to the jars. And just a reminder, we're not adding water to the jars, we're just adding boiled rice. Save this and Mike can have it for his tea later. Now, initially, nothing of any particular value really happened, but here we are in week 12, and this is our Pollyanna jar. Now, as you can see, there's a slight discolouring of the rice, a little bit of yellowing around and a little bit of separation, but not to the extent that we saw in the jar that we ignored. So let's just put them side by side to get a little bit of perspective. So there's definitely a difference there. But what we're really interested in, what we all want to know, is what happened to that negative jar. So before I go into the big reveal, I want you to consider this. I want you to consider why this is relevant to human beings. The human body is made up of billions of cells continually renewing. All of the cells contain water, and this water makes up 50 to 70% of the human body. So this is why we're so interested in the impact of sound and words on water, because that's 50 to 70% of the human body. Now, the second thing I want you to bear in mind is that we spoke to the jars for about a minute a day over a period of 90 days. Now, we did miss a few days out, but let's just say, for argument's sake, it was 90 days, 90 minutes. That's a total of an hour and a half over the period of a few months. Now, just to put that into perspective, think about how much time you spend every single day talking to yourself. What we're showing you here is the impact of an hour and a half of self-talk. So I think if you are chatting to yourself, have a think about what that chat sounds like. Is it positive? Is it negative? Just reflect on that. Because Emoto took this experiment a step further and really looked at not just the impact of sound, but also the impact of the written word and thoughts. And he concluded that it isn't just sound that impacts the construction of water, but the vibration that comes from a sound or even a thought. But the takeaway from this experiment really is the impact of around an hour and a half of negative speaking, which is what we directed at our final jar. So I did speak to this jar eventually just to tell it how awful it looked. Here it is. So it's a little bit yucky. Interestingly enough, there's less separation in the water, which suggests that the sound does keep the rice and the water together, because we saw that it's separated in the ignore jar. And of course, we have all of this discolouring, which shows us the impact of negative self-talk on that water. So a really strong visual there of the impact of negative self-talk on water, and the body is made up of 50 to 70% water. Really easy to do. If you want to try this at home, a couple of jars, have a go and see how you get on. Meanwhile, I hope that next time you're having that little chat with yourself, you'll remember the jars of rice. Take care.